Hello! In this video, I'd like to talk about some of my teaching practices and some of the texts that influence my teaching practices, specifically Understanding by Design and Grading for Equity. This video should have some helpful ideas regardless of where you are in your teaching journey or what you're trying to teach. But I hope it will be particularly helpful if you're teaching a math course, or are trying to plan your teaching for a new course, or just want to change up your grading to better reflect your students' understanding. I've mostly taught college algebra and Calc 1 at the undergraduate level and adapted what I read to these classes. I still have a lot to learn about teaching and a long way to go before my teaching is as effective and equitable as I would like, but my hope with this video is to share the insights I have had in hopes of inspiring your own teaching. I'll start with where I started, with Understanding by Design. When you're entirely in charge of a course, there's lots of really important decisions to make, and it really helps to have a unified vision for how you want everything to fit together, to reduce decision fatigue and to present a unified, coherent whole. Understanding by Design provides this through the philosophy of backward design. The book describes backward design as goal-directed. We aim for specific results and design backward from them accordingly. Backward design is a three-step process for designing a unit or an entire course. First, we identify the desired learning outcomes, a list of things you would like students to know or be able to do when leaving the course. These learning outcomes provide the structure and clarity for the rest of the course designing process. Next, design the assessments to measure these learning outcomes. This is the really backwards part. We're designing our assessments before designing our lessons. Really what's happening here is that you're clarifying your learning outcomes, going from the abstract, locate the critical values of a function f, to a more concrete, here's the type of formulas I would like my students to be able to find the critical values of, and here's the kind of ways I should be able to phrase the problem for students to recognize that they should be finding critical values. Finally, you design your lessons, making sure to cover all the skills and knowledge students will need to know in order to complete the assessment. Students hate it when there's something on the test that wasn't covered in class, and this aims to solve that issue. This also solves the reverse issue, covering topics in class that aren't course goals or won't be on the assessment. Of course, this isn't a strict one-way process. If you find yourself wanting to cover a topic in class that isn't on the test, ask yourself if it would make a good course goal, or if you can't get to a particular topic in class, feel free to remove it from the assessment or move it to a later assessment. If you're having trouble coming up with a list of goals for a particular week, I actually like to start by designing the weekly quizzes first. For each type of problem you'd like students to be able to solve, ask yourself, what knowledge and skills would my students need to have in order to be able to solve these problems? You'll want to start out before the semester starts, getting a rough idea of what your goals will be by working through the textbook and talking with professors who've taught the course before or who teach related courses, but don't put too much work into this. You may find yourself having to adjust your goals once you've worked with your students and have a much better idea of what's reasonable to expect of them, or you might have to adjust your coverage due to unexpected class cancellations. It's also worth checking to see if you already have standards you're supposed to follow. For instance, New York State has the standard for Algebra 2, which is roughly equivalent to college algebra, extend the properties of exponents to rational exponents. 1. Explore how the meaning of rational exponents follows from extending the properties of integer exponents. Okay, that's not really testable, but 2. Convert between radical expressions and expressions with rational exponents using the properties of exponents is, and you can pull these both apart to get finer goals. As we see, there are different levels of goal, and it's only one specific level that I'd actually like to assess. Big ideas aren't really the kinds of things you can test with an individual question or maybe should be assessing at all, and are more for guiding the overall structure of your course. You'll want to eventually organize your goals to be able to identify these big ideas, these recurring themes. but I suggest focusing on this only after you've taught the course a few times. For instance, I want my college algebra students to appreciate that all of the manipulations they've learned for working with numbers also work for algebraic expressions. But this is a broad, overarching goal that manifests itself in lots of smaller goals, a theme for connecting these smaller goals. For instance, being able to work with fractions with variables in them, being able to solve equations with extra variables in them, and so on and so forth. It's these more specific goals that I'll actually test my students on. The main goals I want to focus on are specific testable outcomes. Specifically, what do I want my students to come away from the course knowing? What specific types of problems do I want my students to leave the course being able to do? I'll go over some examples in the next slide to give you an idea of these specific types of goals. It's also worth investigating whether a goal is actually something you want students to leave the course with. Some goals I have are just things I want my students to have done, but not necessarily remember long term. For instance, I want my Calc 1 students to have applied the limit definition of the derivative to calculate a derivative. This is a really essential part of Calc 1, but it's not one of my learning objectives for a quiz. Instead, I take the component skills, remembering the definition, setting up the limit, and computing the limit, and test each of them separately. But is specifically calculating a derivative using the limit definition ever going to be useful for my students? Well, maybe, but only if they wind up taking real analysis. And sometimes when writing a list of objectives, I have something that I just want my students to have seen. For instance, when we talk about the quadratic formula in college algebra, I want my students to have seen that there's also a cubic formula, just so that they have in the back of their heads that it's there, but I don't expect them to engage with it at all. There's also an important distinction between whether or not this is a student's first time seeing a particular piece of material in deciding what's reasonable to expect. There's a natural arc, for instance, from seeing function notation before college algebra to reviewing function notation and then being introduced to function composition in college algebra, to reviewing function composition in Calc 1 and applying it. At each stage, I expect more when I assess my students. I find that there's real value in letting some topics simmer in students' minds, and not just trying to rapidly build up a topic week after week after week. In my college algebra class, I moved exponent rules from just before exponentials and logarithms all the way back to the beginning of class to give my students more time to make sure they had the basics down before building off of them. New memories stick better if there's something solid for them to stick to. Here's an example of 1 week's worth of skills in Calc 1, the week I'm reviewing curve sketching. Locate the critical values of a function f, and determine when a function f is increasing or decreasing. These are actually kind of vague goals. I had specific types of formulas in mind when I wrote this, and I should have written them down when I was writing out these goals. Construct a sign chart for f prime. A sign chart looks something like this and keeps track of where on the number line a function or its first or second derivatives are positive, negative, 0, or undefined. Locate local maxima and minima given a sign chart for f prime. Here I've broken the single goal of locating maxima and minima of a function using the first derivative test into first constructing a sign chart and then interpreting it. Construct a simultaneous sign chart for f prime and f double prime. This one's interesting because constructing a sign chart for f prime is a strict subgoal of this one. I try to avoid this, but it's inevitable in some circumstances. And then converting back and forth between a sign chart and the shape of a graph. Again, this was a single goal of being able to sketch a function broken up into 2 parts. And then I broke apart translating in one direction and translating in the other direction into 2 separate goals as well. My philosophy for creating an assessment is simple. I'm trying to figure out, of the skills I'm interested in, what my students know and what they don't yet know. So first of all, I'm going to want each goal to get its own question. Combining skills into a single question risks muddling up the information. Whether a student knows one skill can affect my ability to accurately measure the other. For example, suppose I wanted to know whether a Calc 1 student knew the derivative of sine of x. I could include this as part of a chain rule problem. Calculate the derivative of sine of x squared. But if a student doesn't know the chain rule, they might not even be aware that they're supposed to take the derivative of sine of x as part of the problem. They may or may not know what the derivative of sine of x is, and I might have no way of knowing. I like to take this philosophy to its logical conclusion. Each question should be the simplest possible question testing that course goal. Adding extra complexity risks muddling up the information I want for exactly the same reason. This philosophy has been misinterpreted as prohibiting complexity, but that's not really what I'm going for. What's really happening is that dealing with various levels of complexity is a goal that you're measuring, and you should be explicit about this goal, honest with both yourself and your students. You can have whatever question of whatever level of complexity you want on your assessments, as long as you have solve a question on this topic at this level of complexity as one of your goals. Let's look at an example. One of my explicit course goals for Calc 1 is that students should be able to solve problems combining multiple uses of the advanced derivative rules, the chain, product, and quotient rules. I could test this skill with a problem like this. It requires both a quotient rule and a chain rule to work out the derivative of the denominator. But this question is a bad measure for my purposes because students might do poorly on this question in ways that affect their ability to demonstrate using multiple advanced rules. My students might be able to solve problems combining multiple uses of the chain, product, and quotient rules, but not be able to demonstrate that skill on this particular question because of its complexity. A good way to see this is to look at all of the skills that students will need to be successful on the problem. First, they'll need to be able to recognize derivative notation, that this is a derivative problem. Next, they'll need to be able to parse the formula, recognize it as a formula divided by the square root of another formula. I imagine some students having trouble with the pi plus 1 and square root of 7 in particular. They'll also need skills for working with complicated formulas, copying them accurately from one step to the next. They'll need to know the power rule for fractional exponents to deal with the x to the e and x to the 5.5 and possibly also the square root. They'll need to be fluent in the sum and difference rules. They'll need to know the derivative of cosine of x. They'll need to be able to take the derivative of square root of x either by memorizing it or by rewriting it as x to the 1/2 and applying the fractional exponent rules. And if they're clever, they might even rewrite the square root in the denominator as to the -1/2. So students' trajectories through this problem might be very different, making it harder to grade. And of course, students will need to know the quotient rule, or maybe the product rule if they use that trick, and they'll need to be skilled in avoiding errors over a long computation. That's a lot of skills being tested, and they might obfuscate the skill that I actually want to measure. If I see a square root of 7 minus sine of x minus 4, is it supposed to represent the term under the square root, or its derivative? Still, these are important skills, and if a student plans on moving on to some physics courses, for instance, they might need to be able to work with formulas of this level of complexity. You might have as a course goal, students should be able to solve derivative problems of this rough level of complexity, and then you could put this problem on an assessment since it's a simplest problem testing this goal. I should take a moment to point out that what I've done here, taking a problem and identifying all of the skills students might demonstrate in solving it, is really useful for creating a rubric for traditional grading. I'll talk about my own grading practices in a bit, but back when I was a grad student TA, we were each put in charge of particular problems on exams and had to come up with rubrics for them and grade every instance of that question across all sections to hopefully make the grades more uniform across sections. And I found it really easy to check off, did this student demonstrate this skill, yes or no? And so having such a list of skills and assigning each of them a point value can really help you make good rubrics for even the most complicated problems. But let's compare with a problem I actually used to test multiple uses of the advanced derivative rules. This problem here still tests a bunch of skills, but is more likely to give me a sense if my student can meet the goal. It still tests recognizing derivative notation, it still tests parsing formulas, although avoids some of the common pitfalls we saw before. It tests the derivative of sine of x and ln of x, which is actually trickier. Of the basic derivatives, ln of x was less common for my students to have memorized. It also tests the derivative of x squared, which I've found is actually slightly more likely for students to know than other polynomials. And then it tests the chain rule and the product rule. Of the three advanced derivative rules, the chain, product, and quotient rules, I find that students are most likely to have trouble with the quotient rule. But this problem isn't testing the quotient rule. I have a separate problem for that. This problem is testing combining advanced rules. And so I wanted to combine the rules my students are most likely to know to avoid the situation where they can't demonstrate their combining rules skills because they don't know, for instance, the quotient rule. Here, as another example, I have my example goals and example questions to test them for my quiz on fractions for college algebra. I've deliberately made these very simple so my students can focus on showing off the skills I want to test and not the other auxiliary skills that I test elsewhere. Once I know what I want to test, I then have to teach it. I consider it really unfair to test a skill if you don't teach it, and students do too. Most of my classes are the same style. I'm mostly going to want my students to do practice problems. But in order to get started, there's usually some information my students are going to need. I try to keep lecture as short as possible to provide this information, but I do love talking about math. Lectures alone aren't enough to get students to learn things. Memory is the residue of thought, so I need my students to be actively mentally engaging with the knowledge and procedures I taught them about in order for them to stick. I'm setting my students up for long-term retention of the material by first putting the information into their short-term memory through my lectures, and then the worksheets, the actually solving problems, the actually having to think about things, moves that information, moves those skills into long-term memory. There's a real art to designing good worksheets. I find it helpful to start off with a relevant review problem if there's something this new topic builds off of. This brings up the previous topic in students' minds, making it more likely for them to connect the new material to what they already know. As a bonus, having some easier or review problems at the beginning of a worksheet gets students more invested in the worksheet. If a student can't even figure out how to start a worksheet, they might just tune it out. But if a student gets stuck a bit into the worksheet, the same principle behind the sunk cost fallacy seems to apply, and they seem more likely to seek help as opposed to giving up. Now, doing a worksheet in class is not time for me to sit on my butt. I don't expect my students to be able to solve all the problems I give them on first seeing them. So as I walk around the room supervising, I try to give the impression of being available to answer questions. Students really aren't going to know what they do and do not know in order to solve certain types of problems until they actually try to solve those types of problems. So I want this to happen during class when I'm available to answer my students' questions, not, for instance, working on homework while they're on their own. This is an important message that I want my students to be asking questions while working on worksheets, so I also explicitly state it several times. And I don't grade the worksheets, which also subtly sends the message that these worksheets are exclusively for my students' benefit. It's also very important that I catch any errors my students make. The last thing I want is for my students to be practicing the wrong techniques for solving a problem. I really like the idea of doing activities on the computer because it means students get instant feedback on if they solved the problem correctly or not, but there are downsides to computer activities as well, so I usually prefer worksheets. A really good digital experience can adapt to students, feeding them randomized variations of problems again and again until they get them. It's harder to make worksheets adaptable, but it is possible. When designing a worksheet, I know that some of my students will only make it through the first page, and some of my students will finish early. So I try to make sure that everything I want all my students to have done shows up on the first, maybe the first 2 pages. Then I have a bunch more practice problems I expect most of my students to get to, and then I put some cool optional stuff at the end, usually connections to further math topics to keep my most advanced students entertained. This isn't quite as ideal as a digital experience. It can be a bit disheartening for a student to get a large packet and only be able to make it through the first page, but I repeatedly make it clear that this is the expectation. One of my rather unusual goals for Calc 1 is that I want my students to be able to compute quadratic approximations given the formula. One of the high-level skills I want my students to take away from Calc 1 is the ability to work with formulas with derivatives in them. I'm not sure exactly where my students will wind up using calculus in the future, but I want to make sure that whenever it does come up, they're able to plug the appropriate things in the appropriate places in the formulas they're given. So I have some explicit formulas I want my students to practice plugging things into, including the formula for quadratic approximations. Let me walk you through what I'm thinking when I'm trying to design an introductory worksheet on quadratic approximations. First, I want my students to connect quadratic approximations with the linear approximations they already know. So I give them a linear approximation problem or two that's phrased in the same way that I plan on phrasing my quadratic approximation problems, including giving my students the formula for linear approximations. At this point in the class, I expect my students to already know this formula, but it's more important here to make the connection in terms of what we're going to want to plug in where than to get that practice. And I want my students who haven't yet memorized that linear approximation formula to still be able to follow along. Next, I have a sequence of quadratic approximation problems, starting off with some really basic things like e to the x, sine of x, cosine of x, and getting a bit more complicated as we go forward. At some point in the worksheet, I want my students to do some numerical comparisons to appreciate how quadratic approximations compare to linear approximations. So I make sure that some of the functions we're calculating quadratic approximations to also show up in the linear approximation problems at the beginning, so that when my students hit these comparison problems, they've already done the work to get started. I also try to make sure that these comparisons are instructive. I find students tend to really appreciate approximations for square roots, and I also want my students to see cases like sine of x at 0, or approximating faraway values, where going to a quadratic approximation doesn't really help. But here's the thing, these numerical comparisons aren't actually what I want my students to be practicing. So I'm going to put them after what I think will be sufficient practice with the quadratic approximation problems. I want to make sure that my students who don't have time to get to both still get to practice a decent number of quadratic approximation problems. Appreciating that quadratic approximations can be better than linear approximations is a have seen it goal, so it's much lower priority. Then finally, I'll include some problems on the last page, clearly labeled as bonus problems, talking about cubic approximations and mentioning the term Taylor series, so students can look up more if they're interested. I also want to talk here about another major influence on my teaching, grading for equity, since its standards-based grading fits really nicely in with understanding by design's backward design. Grading for equity proposes the following philosophy for grading. Grades should be based on valid evidence of a student's final content knowledge and not based on evidence that is likely to be corrupted by a teacher's implicit bias or reflect a student's environment. So this means that 100% of a student's final grade should be based on their demonstration of course learning objectives in a way where the standards are clear to students. It should be clear to them what they need to do in order to get certain grades. It also means that, since we want grades to reflect a student's final content knowledge, that if a student misses out on the points for a particular learning objective, they should have plenty of opportunities to make that up for full credit. And grading for equity also encourages us to avoid as much as possible factors outside of proficiency in learning objectives that affect students' grades. The last thing I want to do as a professor is be part of the feedback loops that maintain and exacerbate socioeconomic inequality. And including factors in students' grades that reflect more their privilege than their understanding is part of these feedback loops. For instance, if you include homework in your grades, that's likely to reflect whether students have jobs or if they have access to spaces conducive to study, disadvantaging students from less privileged backgrounds. It's important to note that despite its title, the practices suggested in grading for equity aren't intended to be perfectly equitable. They're intended to be easy to implement improvements over traditional grading while we work to eliminate grades entirely. Grading for equity spends a lot of time criticizing grading, but it's clear that these criticisms are still mostly applicable to the practices suggested by the book. I'm not sure how one could expect truly equitable outcomes while assigning students unequal grades in a world where grades have real impacts on students. Standards-based grading says that one should calculate students' final grades using a spreadsheet not based on students' performance on individual assignments, but keeping track of students' maximal demonstrated performance on individual course learning objectives. It's quite a lot to expect of students that on top of everything else they have to do, they should learn a brand new grading system. But fortunately, I have a really good proxy for my learning objectives: individual quiz questions. Remember that my backward design gave me a bunch of quiz questions, each designed to try to, as best as possible, test whether a student can meet a particular course goal. All I have to do is give a grade of 0 or 1 to each question, measuring if the student has, in their solution, demonstrated the corresponding learning objective. I don't even care if they get the problem correct or not, just whether they demonstrated that objective. I tell my students that if they make a basic arithmetic error, as long as I can figure out what they're doing and they're doing the right thing, they'll still get full points. And then I calculate students' final grades as just the percentage of quiz questions they're eventually able to get correct. And in order to make sure that my measurement of the percent of learning objectives a student can demonstrate proficiency in is always up to date, I give my students tons of opportunities to retake quiz questions they haven't gotten the points for yet. By presenting reassessing learning objectives as retaking quiz questions, something my students are more likely to be familiar with, my grading system becomes easier for them to understand and keep track of. It's important to note that this percentage of course goals demonstrated approach is not properly tuned. One of the major goals of grading for equity is that grades should be mathematically accurate. A student who demonstrates proficiency in course goals to a B-level standard, whatever that means, should get a B in the course. And that won't necessarily be the case if I pick my course goals to be too easy or too difficult. One idea I had was to do a tiered system. I would designate each goal as an A-level goal, a B-level goal, or a C-level goal, and a student's final grade would depend on what percentages of which tiers of goals they were able to demonstrate. But this is way too complicated. The solution that I landed on was just to make sure that about 75% of my goals were things I expected my C-level students to be able to do, etc. If, as the semester went on, I noticed that my students were largely not scoring as well as I expected them to based on my observations during in-class worksheets, I would fiddle with the course goals to make the next quiz a little easier if I could. Don't be afraid to surprise curve in students' favor at the end of the semester if you have to. But I haven't really had to do this. I've found that as long as I stay on top of things and have quizzes every week to really get accurate, up-to-date information, my students' end of semester grades tend to work out to be really accurate to what I expect them to be. It's also worth noting that with my system, I noticed students' grades during the semester to be a bit lower than usual because I wasn't awarding partial credit. But at the end of the semester, when all the retakes came in, students had slightly higher grades than usual, since the retakes make the system better at capturing my students' final level of understanding of the course material, as opposed to midterm level of understanding of the course material. Grading for equity also suggests possibly having course-level rubrics, identifying a small number of broader course goals and being really clear about what demonstrating that goal to an A, B, C, or D level looks like. Students' final grades are then the average of the maximum grade level demonstrated across all the columns of the rubric. This seems to be the preferred method of grading upper-level math courses. It's really tricky to do unlimited retakes without overworking yourself, and it might not even be possible for large enough courses, but let me share with you the tricks I worked out to speed up the retake process. The biggest compromise I made was having only small variations on the makeup versions of most of my problems, changing around the numbers or the formulas slightly, but keeping the overall problem the same unless it was clear that students misunderstood the original problem, in which case I varied it up. This is less than ideal, but compromises are necessary. I also had dedicated office hours for makeups. It's very easy to supervise a bunch of students working on makeup problems, and as long as students are working on different things, you can even review the problems they got wrong on the makeup, which is a really essential part of the makeup process. But here's the thing, when I had makeups just during office hours, some of my students were regularly coming in, and others just accepted the grade they got the first time. What this meant was that a student's level of persistence at these makeups, which was in turn a reflection of their background, level of privilege, self-confidence, how much time they could spare outside of class, etc., had a massive impact on my students' final grades. Grading for equity is aware of this source of data muddling, asserting that retakes are equitable only when they are mandatory. In later semesters, I included, alongside each quiz, a makeup version of the previous week's quiz, where I had circled on each makeup quiz the problems each student still had to make up. I also replaced the traditional midterm and final exams with what I called makeup midterms and makeup finals, where I just handed out to each student makeup versions of all of the questions they still hadn't gotten the points for yet. These went over great, and my students really appreciated having a much lower stress assessment in my class, while they had higher stress assessments at the same time in their other classes. I reassure my students with these makeup midterms and makeup finals that their grades can only go up. These extra sources of makeup questions also meant I had fewer students wanting to come to office hours to make up questions, because they had already made up those questions in class. Before I implemented makeup finals, I was particularly overwhelmed by students wanting to make up questions at the end of the semester, but this became much more reasonable when I started implementing makeup finals. Keeping the retake workload reasonable also meant speeding up the grading process as much as possible. Each problem got a grade of 0 or 1 based on if my student demonstrated the corresponding skill or not. There was no partial credit and as little subjectivity as possible. Of course, some subjectivity is always going to happen, and it's important to be honest with yourself that it's always going to happen. I also worked out a method for streamlining the entering of grades. Our online gradebook let us make assignments with rubrics, and I just had each question be a separate entry in the rubric that could be scored a 0 or a 1. This way, students could see what they needed to make up, and I could just switch the corresponding rubric entry when they did. Although I'd love to have an online grading spreadsheet that was explicitly designed for this type of grading system. If this is your first time trying a new grading system like this, don't feel bad substantially reducing the number of problems you plan on grading. Use a reduced list of course goals. And if a student consistently pesters you for retakes, feel free to require them to show that they've done some practice problems before retaking. I didn't include the online homework as part of students' final grades, but I could ask them to do the online homework before being able to retake a particular week's worth of material if they were particularly bothersome. Retakes can be a lot of work, especially to get started, but they're well worth the trouble. Retakes encourage a growth mindset in students. The fact that a student didn't know something at the midterm shouldn't affect their final grade if they later can demonstrate it, and you're showing that you believe that this is likely enough that you've explicitly set up the system to measure and reward it. And it's really great to see students realize how much they've grown over a course. I've had a number of students surprised by how easy the Quiz 1 questions they missed were when they came back to them at the end of the semester. With retakes, a student's final grade reflects their final level of understanding of the course material. Again, I don't think it's particularly useful to indicate whether or not a student understood something at the midterm. The real question is, what did they understand at the end of the course? Retakes work especially well in cumulative courses like math courses, because I need my students to develop proficiency in early course objectives in order to be able to make sense of the later parts of the course. Retakes explicitly reward students for identifying the early course skills they need to review and reviewing them. Having retakes also can sometimes prevent students from giving up on a course. Under traditional grading, if a student gets a low grade on an early big assignment, they might effectively be or actually be doomed in the course, in which case it makes sense for them to give up on it entirely and focus on their other classes. With retakes, students are always on track to get a perfect score in the course, although this might not be practical if they're too far behind and have stuff to do in their other classes. Another important point is that you probably already have to offer retakes. SUNY Oswego, for instance, requires professors to offer makeup exams for students who miss exams for religious observances, military obligations, and athletic team obligations, and alternative testing for students with disabilities. If your institution doesn't have precise specifications for when you should offer retakes, or if you want to go further than the bare minimum you're required, you can get bogged down in questions of whether various students deserve makeup exams. Unless your policy is that all students should get makeups in all circumstances. There's something really nice about not just being kind, in this case letting a student retake an assessment, in particular instances, but baking the kindness into your teaching policies. Having flexible policies might seem like the kindest thing you can do, and it is important to be flexible if you suddenly discover that your policies aren't as kind as you would like, but having fixed policies that capture this kindness reduces any opportunities for your own personal biases to slip in. There's lots of reasons students might experience significant disruptions to their semesters, necessitating retakes or modified schedules, whether it's for health reasons or maybe to take care of their families or whatever. It's not my business. Not experiencing a significant disruption to your semester isn't a course goal, so I'd like it to not be reflected in a student's final grade. And Grading for Equity points out that it's students from less privileged backgrounds that tend to be more affected by significant disruptions to their semesters, so failing to account for it further reinforces socioeconomic inequality. Universal retakes are also great for students with test anxiety, although only once they've properly internalized that they won't be penalized in the long term for mistakes on assessments. I've worked with a number of students where my class was their first college math class, and that means that for some of them, they had no idea what to expect of quizzes or exams. Early on in my career, I helped reduce this disadvantage by offering practice exams, in-class activities where I gave my students a past semester's exams and let them ask me questions as they worked through it. Students loved this, but now each quiz serves as a practice, if necessary, for the makeup quiz. You can also easily substitute alternative means of assessment for a particular course goal if a student isn't a great test taker. I've heard some professors alternately let their students summarize a topic or give a presentation on it, but I'm skeptical of anything where I don't know if it was my student who actually did the work. While it still runs into a few fundamental problems, like students constantly feeling like they're being judged and feeding into the unjust system of providing different life outcomes based on performance in class, there's a lot good to say about a retakes-based grading system, particularly one that's integrated with one's course goals and teaching. So thanks for watching. I have much more to learn about teaching, but I hope this video was able to give you some ideas about how to practically integrate backward design and standards-based grading into your classes. Let me know if you have any questions or comments below, and be kind to each other.